This is The Red Line, where we interview three geopolitical experts on one big issue shaping the news both here and overseas. And I'm your host, Michael Hilliard. It may be hard to grasp, but this week will mark the 1-year anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But as much as this battle is being fought with cutting-edge drones and cyber warfare in some areas, in others we see areas inhabited with scenes that wouldn't be out of place decades ago. It's a battle where we see Cold War Soviet-era machinery rolling back into the battlefield. We see armoured spearheads reminiscent of the battles of World War II. And even in some places, like Bakhmut, trenches that wouldn't seem amiss on the battlefields of World War I. It seems like another European trope, but an old Churchill quote is reappearing to laugh at us from the pages of history. The quote in question being that European generals are always prepared to fight the last war. As anyone who follows history will tell you, the French entered World War I with bright uniforms, drummers and set formations, reminiscent of the glory days in the Napoleonic era, and were then subsequently torn apart by the modern artillery. They entered the Second World War pinning their hopes on the Maginot Line, a thick network of bunkers, barriers and trenches designed to defend a static First World War style battle. But when the Second World War kicked off and push came to shove, the Germans simply ran around it. Fast forward again, and the French go into the Cold War with huge standing armies, tanks and nuclear weapons, ready to fight large armoured formations on the plains of Europe, but instead ended up fighting proxies in Vietnam. Even after the Cold War, where Europe held on to most of their tanks and heavy aircraft, it turned out that insurgency fighting would become the name of the game. Theatres where the cutting edge of fighter jet technology has little use against an insurgent with an AK-47. So many of the European generals doubled down and bought a bunch of equipment to craft themselves into the best insurgency fighters out there. But then 2022 came around, and Russia's armoured columns roared back into Ukraine, and in a matter of hours, those lightly armoured French APCs, designed to be able to easily navigate through the streets of Bamako, went from the perfect fighting unit to exactly the wrong piece of equipment for a battlefield now congested with Russian tanks, artillery bombardments and large infantry formations. And once again, Europe was caught prepared to fight the wrong war. But that was a year ago, and since February, Europe seems to have somewhat woken up, and defence leaders from across the continent are now rushing to rebuild the armoured forces they've been neglecting for 3 decades, and crank up the artillery shell plants that have been at minimal capacity for years. But the European defence industry is complicated, with huge industries and monumental supply chains to a point where the tanks boasted about today in press conferences may not hit the European battlefields for another 5 to 10 years. And whilst yes, I am the first to agree that new tanks are exactly what you would need to fight a war against massed Russian armoured columns going toe-to-toe in the farmlands of eastern Ukraine, they're also the exact opposite of what European security partners would need to neutralise growing insurgencies in Africa, or regain control over civil wars emerging in the Balkans, or even fend off a Chinese invasion in the narrow mountain passes of Taiwan. Is this rearmament Europe finally waking up to the threat living on their eastern flank? Or is it yet another installment of European nations once again gearing up for the wrong war? Well, that is the question we're going to be asking today. And to help us figure out why defence procurements have become such an entanglement over the years, and what all of these promises of a rearmed Europe might actually amount to in Ukraine, we turn to our first guest.
Part 1. A continental landmine.
I think before Ukraine, there was evidence that a number of countries, they were sort of ticking up their defence spending. The UK had announced on the back of its integrated review that it was going to increase its defence spending a little bit. Some of the neighbouring countries we saw over recent years, in the Nordics, in Central Europe, that they were sort of looking again at their defence spending and increasing it. But the Ukraine war really has moved things forward quite dramatically, and particularly in some countries.
Neil Melvin is the Director of International Security Studies at RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, with his current research focusing on the emerging international security dynamics in key regions around the world, but most notably Europe and Eurasia. Prior to joining RUSI, Neil was the Director of the Armed Conflict and Conflict Management Program, and then Director of Research at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. He's also held senior advisory positions in the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the Energy Charter, the European Union, and has been a consultant for the United Nations. and we're thrilled to have him back on the program today.
The famous announcement in Germany about the Zeitenwende, the big turn in German strategic thinking, was accompanied by a commitment of 100 billion euros for defense. France has increased or announced it's going to increase up to 2030 its defense spending, very significantly from what it's been before, to 40% from its current level. In Poland, there's ambitions to take their defense spending as high as 4%. I think the UK is revisiting its defense spending after the Ukraine war, and we've got a refresh of the integrated review, which is going to be accompanied by a defense command paper, which is the spending part. That probably is going to be a bit more. So I think, across much of Europe now, we do see a big uptick, which is going to projected to go over several years because of the life cycle of the armament that's involved in this. And this really looks like a rearmament of Europe now.
Military spending is far more difficult to measure than just X country spent X dollars, for a wide myriad of reasons. And how much bang for their buck each country gets from their spending also dramatically differs from country to country. As an example, Russia on paper spends less than the UK does on their military spending, but fields a much larger army than the British ever could. And there's another where Germany actually spends more on the defense than France, and yet France maintains overseas territories, fights counterinsurgencies on multiple continents, and even possesses nuclear weapons. So why is there such variation between what a country spends on defense and what they actually get for that money?
Well, I think that there's a lot of thinking about this over the years, and certainly the purchasing power of your currency is very significant. So, the Russians, their budgets always look smaller, but of course they're basically buying a lot of their kit domestically. It's much cheaper on the whole. And so actually the costs of buying it are generally much, much smaller. There's also, I think, a very different experience of procurement. People, I think, are looking at France at the moment, which has been pretty successful in actually buying a generation of land warfare equipment, tanks, armored vehicles, artillery, and so on, in an integrated and quite effective way, whereas the UK seems to have made a bit of a mess of it. The army's had quite a bit of money over recent years, but has messed up a lot of these purchases. Germany, again, announced they're going to spend 100 billion, but the more people are looking at this, I think the more worried they are that this is really not going to be enough. And much of the problem may not even be the money, but actually the whole system of procurement and organization of contracts, and indeed just the ability to kind of use these weapons. The broad picture is spending is up. That's not necessarily going to translate into a massive increase of capacities evenly across all these countries. I think we may see quite a variegated picture emerging.
Well, let's dive into an example of just how fraught and complicated defense procurement can be. And for this, we'll use Germany, as Germany is notorious for the difficulty in arms procurements because of everything from endless committees to decide what works to companies suing each other during the tender process. So can you take us through the German example of just how complicated defense procurement can be?
Well, it's been over a year now since the announcement of the 100 billion. A lot of people are already starting to say, I think analysts, what's happening? Germany announced a couple of things. It's going to buy the American F-35. But beyond that, it's not really clear. And a lot of the issues that have certainly come out of the Ukraine war is while people may want to buy fancy new systems, the biggest gap in Europe is on readiness and supplies. So it's actually in the more humdrum areas of investment about building up ammunition stocks, having actually the troops that you have got fully sort of capable of moving quickly and effectively. And so Germany is perhaps in one of the worst situations of all the European countries. So it's not even a question of them buying a whole new generation of tanks or so on. I think a lot of this money is probably going to go into refurbishing accommodation, making sure that their vehicles can actually work when they turn them on, having enough ammunition, having the transporters to move the stuff around. So all of this background investment, which has really been starved over the last 2 decades in Germany, that probably is going to have to be the first priority. And then we get to the whole question, which the war has thrown up, about how Germany is approaching its defense exports and its control of defense exports, which has raised, I think, a trust issue amongst some of its allies about whether they can really buy German equipment when they're not actually able then to use that or to donate it, in this case, to Ukraine in the way that they would like to.
Whilst Europe seems to be talking about defense purchases once again, where they're purchasing from does raise some eyebrows, as Germany is opting to buy American planes and Poland's opting to buy South Korean tanks. rather than looking toward their own defense industries. So why is Europe going abroad to buy their defense equipment rather than building up their own defense capabilities, which would make it much easier to scale up during a future period of war?
Defense procurement is never simply about getting the cheapest and the best, although this is, I think, what the thrust has been for European integration. There's been an idea, really as part of the European dream, I suppose, that Europeans should build up their own defense industry and basically buy from each other. But what we see around the Ukraine war is in fact, that's very rarely going to be what drives these decisions. So one thing that has come up quite quickly around the war is that we need weapons fast. And South Korea is able to actually deliver these systems in large numbers relatively quickly. And so that's one of the reasons why countries are pivoting to buying from South Korea. And it looks like that South Korea may well then set up production inside the European market, particularly around the deal it's got with Poland, where Poland is buying up to 1,000 South Korean K2 tanks and hundreds of South Korean artillery, the K9. And that becomes a bridgehead then for selling that to other countries who want to integrate with Poland, probably. And that brings in the second factor, I think, that's come up on the war, which is the element of trust, is that you tend to buy weapons as part of building relationships. And what has happened with Germany's hesitancy to export its own tanks and to allow others who bought its tanks to sell them on is that there's a concern about being tied to German political decision-making around armaments. So countries are looking beyond Germany now. So we may actually see the future generation of European tanks increasingly coming from outside Europe. Thirdly is the aspect of keeping the United States relationship strong. So many countries are buying from the US just to reconfirm that relationship. And again, it may not be you get the best weapon system, although the US tends to have many of the best, but not always. So countries are buying weapons from the US to cement that tie. I mean, I think the German F-35 decision will clearly see that. Sometimes when Sweden, even before it committed to joining NATO, was buying from the US, I think, to try and lock them in. And then we see countries are often looking to their neighbors, again, to confirm their relationship. So there's been a general uptick in spending. The European Defence Agency has been promoting the idea that there should be joint procurement, and there is an increase in joint procurement, but it's not really at scale. It's not across the EU in large collectives. It's often neighbors, the Czechs and the Slovaks doing things together. And the last element, I think, which is quite a new one, is this, that the war has thrown up the interlinkage between the Indo-Pacific and the European security theatre. So we're seeing a set of relationships which now include military-industrial ties bridging across the two regions. So we have perhaps most notably the UK, Italy, Japan fighter deal. We have, of course, the AUKUS, the strategic alliance between the United States, Australia, and the UK. We see the South Korea tie-up coming in, which is mostly about Poland, but other countries. Norway is looking at buying South Korean. It's quite a lot of artillery already in Europe is being bought from South Korea. I think the UK will probably look to fill its artillery gap by buying again the K9 from South Korea in the next couple of years. So all of that suggests that the concept of integrated European defense purchasing system has really been, to some degree, exploded by the war.
Another almost uniquely European problem is the leftovers from the Cold War. You see, when the USSR and the Warsaw Pact collapsed, countries like Poland, East Germany, Romania, Bulgaria, Czechia, Slovakia, etc., were all left with these huge stockpiles of Russian equipment, mostly all designed for large-scale mobilizations and a march westward. And back then, during the transition period, with their economies wrecked, many of them prioritized keeping the power on in the country rather than ditching all their old T-72s. And that same conversation has been going on and on and on. And since then, many of these countries look at their tanks and wonder if it's worth spending the huge amounts of money to shelve these tanks and upgrade to expensive NATO-style ones. And while some in Europe like Germany have made that call, others have simply chosen to pay the lesser amount to just maintain their existing stockpiles. In fact, this situation is why Europe and even EU countries are still producing Soviet-style 152mm artillery shells and knockoff Russian parts in quite large quantities. But as weird as it sounds, it was an absolute godsend for Ukraine, as Ukraine was one of those nations who were still using majority Soviet-style equipment. So when the February offensive kicked off, Europe was able to very quickly flood Ukraine with their stockpiles of either leftovers from the 90s or the reproduced Russian caliber shells that were perfect for the Ukrainian guns. So with a lot of Europe's Warsaw Pact stockpiles now donated to Ukraine, and more countries within Europe taking the plunge to overhaul and refit their armies to NATO standard, do you think the days of Soviet-style armament producers in Europe are numbered?
We've now seen really a transition away from the Soviet stuff. And I mean, the Ukrainians are also pivoting away from Soviet stocks to some degree as they move on to NATO standards, and looking ahead, that's going to be the way forward. So I think there's not really much point anymore. I mean, even if there was a need to supply countries like Georgia with those kind of things, it'd be relatively small amounts. I mean, Ukraine has been an enormous drain on all of that stuff, but I think we've really passed that point now. So the challenge really, I think, is now to move Ukraine onto NATO standard equipment completely. That's not going to happen in immediate years, but part of the long-term assuring Ukraine's defense and security will be building its armed forces in a way that it can protect itself from future Russian aggression, and that's going to be done on NATO standard stuff. Although again, it may be that we see that it's NATO standard, but not in Europe. It's not impossible that the Ukrainians, once they start to look at future procurement, given the fact that Poland is going to buy its 1,000 tanks from South Korea, it might make more sense to actually buy also the same kind of tanks so they can integrate together rather than buying a Leopard 2, which is going to have different spare parts and require different levels of training and support. So we're going to get, I think, a different picture emerging than the idea of a single integrated European defense market that perhaps even 2 years ago, there was a strong feeling that moment had come.
But NATO-style equipment is usually quite expensive. And for a poorer nation like Bulgaria, wouldn't they be better off buying 1,000 Russian AK-74s or AK-12s rather than just 100 US M4 rifles for the same price? After all, the Bulgarian army is more designed to keep peace within the country than launch large-scale offensives in any direction.
I mean, the most important thing is interoperability. So if the equipment is interoperable with NATO, then of course that would make sense. And we've seen that some of the difficulties when you don't have that, even supplying Ukraine, where Ukraine is now going to be potentially supporting 3 different Western tank systems, all with different spare parts, some with different shells, different loaders for moving these things. So, I mean, as long as you can ensure interoperability is the fundamental principle, then that's the starting point. Beyond that, of course, it is going to depend on countries' ability to spend. I think for countries like Bulgaria and Romania, which are really on the front line now, this is the moment where, particularly on Bulgaria's case, which is, I mean, they've avoided rearming since the end of the Soviet Union. They've been running really Soviet-era equipment well beyond the life perhaps it should have been in the fighter and land warfare, but even on their naval capabilities. So rather than buying at this point, continuing to buy from Russia, which, I mean, how politically would that work? This is the moment for all these countries, I think, to now start to look for Western equipment.
Most of the countries looking to undertake that overhaul and upgrade are spending the vast majority of money resupplying their army and ground defenses, meaning that as part of this upgrade, Europe's navies are largely being left behind. Is there a worry in the defense community that whilst, yes, Europe building up their ground forces will allow them to have a large amount of battle tanks, but down the line they won't have a decent enough navy to fight battles in the Arctic or even the Pacific?
Yeah, I mean, this is a big discussion, I think, and we'll see this going up to Vilnius, the NATO summit, as to what is going to be the commitments that the NATO states are going to make. There's going to be a discussion about defense spending. Are we going to try and go beyond 2% as the goal? But part of that is then the question of how much is going to go into land warfare. I mean, some countries who are neighboring Ukraine clearly feel very threatened, and they put a lot into that. The UK, which has hollowed out its land warfare, I think there's a lot of discussion now about trying to reconstitute that. But you do wonder whether actually having a few hundred UK tanks that could go all the way across Europe to the eastern flank really be rather a small contribution in the context of the vast forces that are being built up there, where the resources might be better spent in other areas. And for the UK, that would be probably on the flanks, northern flank, but also Black Sea, East Mediterranean, which is essentially a maritime and air contribution. If you look ahead also, there is a question about what sort of threat is Russia going to really be to NATO, because it's being pretty degraded in many respects. And we'll see what happens now in the spring campaign, where there's going to be some pretty intense fighting going on in Ukraine. The Russians are going to lose a lot more equipment. this is going to take a while to reconstitute themselves. So actually, even on the land warfare side, in the next 5 to 10 years, the Russians may be relatively weak. So their main threat actually to NATO may indeed be on this maritime flanks, where their navy and their air force has been relatively immune so far from damage from the Ukraine war. And so those forces remain largely intact. And I would estimate that the Russians will probably rely more on those to use as a way to threaten NATO than they will do by some idea of armored forces punching through Ukraine and then punching through the eastern flank, because that's going to be I think, a task that was going to be far beyond the Russians.
The war in Ukraine has also brought up a lot of questions about quantity versus quality. And to explain what I mean by this, whilst yes, the US Reaper drones are probably one of the best on the market at the moment, they also come with a $16 million price tag on them. And for that price, you could buy 3 to 4 Turkish Bayraktar TB2 drones, which when engaging with an enemy at this distance, pretty much do the same thing. And nations might feel that it's not as much of a risk to put a TB2 out, as losing one won't lose $16 million. And even continuing with that argument a bit further, the items we see most requested by the Ukrainian soldiers are these refitted $500 hobby drones, which are capable of carrying a grenade over to the enemy trench. It would be quite hard to argue that Ukraine would be better off buying one Reaper drone as opposed to 32,000 of these hobby drones. And so for them, quantity is trumping quality. But now looking back at Western Europe, are they also having this same debate within their defense forces? That maybe a large amount of medium good equipment might be better off than a small amount of good equipment.
Yeah, I think this is one of the conundrums that comes out of the Ukraine war, is that drones and high-end tech, it's shown its value. I mean, there's no doubt about it that it's crucial. But at the same time, what we've seen is there's very high attrition in this war. So if you have a great, really expensive system, that's great. It's going to make a big impact, but it's not going to last very long. So, I mean, you're going to run out of these things very fast. And so actually there's going to have to be some kind of balance, I suspect, in which, again, you're going to have to spend more money in general to extend your capabilities, but you're going to have to look at layering these, because the attrition rate on drones is literally in hours often, particularly on the cheaper ones, certainly in days on the most expensive ones. And no matter how well protected you are in the warfare that we've seen in Ukraine, you cannot stop that attrition happening. You can perhaps slow it down a little bit, but it's still going to happen. And that's true across all these spectrums. So we've even seen that around armor, where there was a feeling a couple of years ago that the era of the tank was over. And some countries, such as the Netherlands, Norway, have sort of given up on the idea of having tanks before Ukraine. The UK has cut down the number of tanks it's going to support to a very low number. Now everyone thinks, actually tanks have been shown to be really important in this war alongside artillery. But again, they've been important, but the attrition has also been extremely high. So if you're going to be in the tank business, it's not just a question of having a few. You're going to need a lot, because you are going to lose them. So there's probably no way around this, that if you want to really have a force that is capable of fighting on a sustained basis, there's going to have to be a big investment. You can't simply just choose one system or another. You're going to have to invest in a lot of different systems, and defense spending is going to have to go up to meet that.
With that in mind, there's another strange aspect to the European defense industry. With any other industry, the Europeans would start to take advantage of economies of scale and fracturing their supply chains. The Europeans would pick one tank, one plane, one APC, one rifle, and make enough of that unit to supply all of Europe's armies, taking advantage of economies of scale and bringing the cost per unit price right down. And even as a bonus, it would also make supplying spare parts and repairs even easier, and bring the cost of that right down as well. And on top of that, you'd think the Europeans would fracture their supply chains, building the labor-intensive parts of the tanks, like the armor or the treads, in countries with cheap labor like Romania and Poland, and then building the technical computing parts in nations like Germany or France, which is the exact process the European auto industry does. But Europe doesn't do that when it comes to the defense industries. Instead, they have a French industry, a British industry, a German industry, an Italian industry, a Polish industry, etc., etc. So why doesn't Europe undertake what every Economics 101 textbook would tell them to do?
I mean, that goes, I think, to the heart of the whole way that actually defense industry works, because often behind the rhetoric of the European defense industry are very clear national interests. So when France talks about the European industry, defense industry, they normally mean the French defense industry. And so there's a strong desire to actually steer European defense spending into French companies. And so we'll see this. France, which has been leading on the idea of strategic autonomy for Europe and strengthening European defense, it's now announced this huge amount of money it's going to spend. Well, how is it going to spend that? Is it going to buy weapon systems from the UK companies, from Swedish companies, from Czech companies, and actually drive a European integration? And it's the same with the 100 billion that the Germans have got. Is that going to be spent across Europe? My guess is probably not. Because, in fact, again, one of the lessons that comes out of the Ukraine war is that the states remain the key sovereign actors in Europe, and countries still think primarily in terms of national defense. Even if they're cooperating with others through NATO, they retain the idea of national defense, and they want to make sure that there are sovereign value chains inside the country that they can deliver on that. And so much of the defense discussions, I think, are going to remain very national because of that. And we see that even in the efforts to try and do these high symbolic joint procurements. The French and the Germans have been leading on this. They have some of these big projects, the future European fighter jet, the future European tank. Both of these projects are completely now mired in national caveats about what actually each country needs and wants, which may well actually kill both these projects in the future. We'll see. I mean, certainly the European tank idea is struggling, and this is why I think there's a real risk for the Europeans that actually countries in Asia, particularly the South Koreans, may well sweep in and actually take much of the European tank market for themselves because they have this product ready to go, and it doesn't actually require this cooperation. We've got a similar dilemma now on the European fighter, in which there's a counter project, the UK, Italy, Japan, and Sweden probably coming into that too. So again, it's a functional network that's built around delivering a product. It's not necessarily about European integration and promoting the European defense industry per se. It's about all those countries developing their national defense industries, but in cooperation. So this is the reality that's coming out of the war, is that there's a rearmament happening, but it's very nationally based, and all cooperation is really being determined by those national priorities fundamentally, rather than some idea of a European collective interest. I think we remain as far from that dream as ever in some respects.
Britain, France, and Germany were all largely caught off guard when the Russians crossed the border again back in February. Britain had been neglecting her tank and artillery forces for years. France was in a period of transition and trying to convince other armies in Europe to hold off on their repairs or refits and instead buy French products. Germany, though, was probably in the worst position of them all. In those early days of the war in Ukraine, people laughed when all Germany sent to Ukraine was a truck worth of helmets, but for Germany, that's kind of all they had to give. You see, after decades of hesitancy to rearm the country, as well as a uniquely German problem with the bureaucracy, meant endless delays in defense procurement. And to take you through an example, when Berlin puts out the request for companies to build the new German artillery system, they'll have 10 different companies apply to build it. But when Germany inevitably picks one over the other 9, due to the German system, those 9 companies can sue the winner of the contract, and German procurement grinds to a halt until all of those lawsuits are settled. It's this sort of years of peacetime bureaucracy that now make it difficult for Germany to rearm quickly in the time of war. But all of that was pre-Ukraine. So what are the Germans, as well as the French and the British, going to do to untangle the web of problems rampant throughout the defense industries? Can they reverse the decades of peacetime sluggishness and get the new generations of tanks to the field in time to help Ukraine? Well, to answer that, we turn to our second guest. This was part 1 of our 4-part series on European rearmament. If you want to keep listening and analyse the upcoming changes to Western European defence policy, simply click the box that just popped up or follow the links in the description.